So today we are going to study dejection and ode. Now, I will not be studying this poem line by line because uh, that will take up too much time. Rather, I would discuss its issues. Okay, and via discussing those issues, we'll be studying the poem. এমন ভাবেই পড়িয়ে দেবো যাতে তোরা নিজেরা লাইন বাই লাইন পড়লেও বুঝে যাস, অসুবিধা না হয়। ওকে, আই হোপ আই এম অডিবল। হ্যাঁ,
Yes,
ওকে, চল, লেটস বিগিন। না, বিফোর উই গো ইনটু দ্য পোয়েম ইটসেলফ, কারণ কোলরিজের তো আর নতুন করে ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড দেওয়ার কিছু নেই। আমরা অলরেডি সেটা করে ফেলেছি কুবলা খানের সময়, অন্যান্য রোমান্টিক পোয়েট্রি পড়ার সময়। সো দ্য ফার্স্ট থিং দ্যাট আই উড লাইক টু গো ইনটু ইজ হোয়াট ইজ অ্যান ওড। নাও, J.A. Carden, who is one of the most relevant authorities on literary terms, Carden defines an ode in a very comprehensive way. আমি সব এক জায়গায় লিখে রেখে দিচ্ছি, অসুবিধা নেই। Carden defines an ode as a lyric poem, usually of some length. The main features are an elaborate stanza structure. Now, this is a very marked formality and stateliness uh, which shows in tone and style, and therefore odes are often very ceremonious in nature. And sometimes they show even lofty sentiments and thoughts. So, if we look at an ode from this perspective, then an ode is a rather grand poem. However, having said this, we can distinguish two basic kinds of odes. One is the public ode, and the other is a private ode. The public ode is used for ceremonious occasions like funerals, birthdays, state events, and the private celebrates rather intense personal subjective occasions. Therefore, the private ode is more than often inclined to be meditative and reflective in nature. Okay. Now, যদি পাবলিক ওড পড়তে চাস তাহলে লর্ড বাইরনের প্রচুর পাবলিক ওড আছে। আর প্রাইভেট ওডস অনেক আছে, যেরকম ধর টেনিসন্স ওড অন দ্য ডেথ অফ দ্য ডিউক অফ ওয়েলিংটন, দ্যাট ইজ another example of a public ode. আর যদি প্রাইভেট ওড পড়তে চাস তাহলে ধর কিটসের নাইটিঙ্গেল বা কিটসের অনেকগুলো ওডই তো আমরা পড়লাম, তো সবকটাই কিন্তু প্রাইভেট ওড। ওকে, নাও therefore ode is this kind of a poem. Now, Dejection and Ode is a poem which was written by Coleridge in 1802. And the poem in its original form was written to Sarah Hutchinson, a woman who was not his wife, uh, but he discusses his love for her in this ode. And the various versions of the poem describe Coleridge's inability to write poetry and living in a state of paralysis. But the published editions often remove his personal feelings and the mention of Hutchinson. Now, if we look at the background in which context the ode was written, then we see that in his notebook, Coleridge mentions Hutchinson and the possible poems that he might write on Hutchinson. And Coleridge writes in his personal notebook, "Can see nothing extraordinary in her, a poem nothing all the virtues of the mild and retired kind, poem on this night on Helvellyn, or William and Dorothy and Mary and Sarah and I, poem on the length of our acquaintance slash all the hours that I have been thinking of her and etc." So he's already mentioning that what he is going to write about, what he might write about, and the mention of Sarah is already there. Now, during this time in 1802, Coleridge was separated from his family and he eventually returned home during March. The relationship between him and his wife restarted and they had a daughter, okay, in December of 1802. However, uh, most of the poems he intended to write about Hutchinson, he managed to complete only one. And an early draft was sent to her in a letter dated 4th April 1802. And the original draft was titled as Letter to Sarah Hutchinson, which later became Dejection and Ode when he sought to publish it. Now, there are many differences between the versions beyond the original. Uh, Say the original was actually 340 lines long, and the printed ones were actually 139 long, 139 lines long. So you see, it's almost half. I mean, lesser than half. Now, what happens is, why is this so? Because the two poems, the original and the printed one, they actually reflect two different moments in Coleridge's emotional struggle with his relationship about himself and Sarah Hutchins. Also, several passages which are describing his childhood and other personal matters were removed between the later versions. Now, it was first published in the 4th October 1802 Morning Post, and the date corresponds to Wordsworth's wedding to Mary Hutchinson. Sarah was Mary's sister, and Coleridge's own wedding anniversary. Now, the poem was grouped with the Asra poems, ASRA, because Coleridge often played with the name Sarah and he quibbled with the word and created the anagram Asra from Sarah, ASRA from SARA. Now, this was basically the Asra poems constitute a series of poems which discuss love, which discuss Coleridge's love for Sarah Hutchinson, and eventually Coleridge cut himself off from the Hutchinson family and renounced his feelings for her, which ended the problems that resulted in the poem. Now, that is a different thing altogether. But before that happened, there was this series of problems. Now, first, I would like to talk about the substance of the poem, and then I'd like to go into the poem itself. Uh, Now, you see, the poem opens with 4 lines of an epigraph which is taken from the Ballad of St. Patrick Spens, which was first printed by Thomas Percy in 1765 in his book Relics of Ancient English Poetry. Now, the Romantic poets of the 19th century were greatly influenced by Percy's collection, and in the lines which are quoted by Coleridge, the speaker says that he has seen the old moon holding the new moon in her arms, and he is frightened. He fears that a deadly storm might follow. Now, such strange forebodings take place in nature. Now, the relevance of these lines, because whenever some poet, সবচেয়ে বেশি এপিগ্রাফ দেখা যায় কিন্তু দেখবি এলিয়েটে, আমরা প্রুফ রক পড়েছি একসঙ্গে, so we know. Now, an epigraph serves a dual purpose. First of all, it locates one poem in the tradition of another poem, and uh, secondly, what an epigraph does is it simply creates a connection between two poems where the one poem becomes a commentary on the other and vice versa. So what happens is that Coleridge's Dejection and Ode becomes a commentary on the poem of Sir Patrick Spens and vice versa. Now, the relevance of these lines is in the fact that Coleridge wants such a storm to come in his life to arouse him from the spiritual slumber that he is now in. And the slumber is painful to the poet because it deprives him of his enjoyment of life and nature and makes him unable to write poetry. And at some stage of life, Wordsworth also felt the same crisis, and he pictured it in his Ode on the Intimations of Immortality. Now, Shelley's invocation to the west wind is also in the same spirit. But unlike Wordsworth or Shelley, Coleridge is very sentimental, and that makes the Immortality Ode and the West Wind Ode superior in quality to Coleridge's Dejection Ode, which is like a downward journey. Now, Dejection and Ode is a verse letter written to a lady, in quotes. Now, there is doubt about the identity of this lady, but people believe that In all likelihood, it was Sarah Hutchinson. Now, Humphrey House, who is one of the greatest critics on the Romantic Age, Humphrey House believes that the revision has affected the merit of the poetry, and in its revised version, he maintains that it fails to achieve complete artistic unity, and therefore it is not a whole poem but rather a fragment. Now, what happens over here is that we see that in the poem, Coleridge is talking about a melancholy of a subdued kind. That is, it does not burst into any strong emotion, and rather it is corroding in his mind. And he looks around and sees that everything in nature is excellently fair, but he is not deeply touched by anything. He sees, but he does not feel. That's what Coleridge says. Now, he continues this tone and he says that he has lost his genial spirits, and the beauty of natural objects and nature can no longer lift from his heart the overwhelming burden of this grief, and his attempts to gaze at the green light on the western horizon is futile, and the real sources of passion and life are within one's own heart, and when they have dried up, he cannot expect the natural forces to animate him anymore. Now, what happens over here is that man receives from nature what he gives to nature, and nature lives in our life. There is the natural joys and sorrows are taken from man, and it appears to be happy or sad according to our own mood and mindset. And the objects of nature are lifeless and cool. So, if we want to see some high or noble quality in nature, then something better than the commonplace uh, that we are seeing in nature, if we want to see anything better, then we must send forth a light, a glory, and a radiance to cover the natural objects from our heart. So it is that we invest nature with meaning. And he says that sweet and powerful voice must come out of human feelings to endow the sounds of nature with sweet charm. Then he mentions a lady. Uh, the lady is addressed to in the poem, and the lady is pure of heart. She is full of joy. Therefore, to her, nature is always festive. And the speaker finds a contrast between his mood and the mood of the lady. And the poem remembers that, the poet remembers that in his earlier days he had this joy, though the path of his life was rough. In those days, he even used his misfortunes as material to weave versions and visions of delight from nature. Then hope was uh, always around him, like a creeper growing around a tree, and natural objects seemed to be his own, as if an extension of his own personality. But now his careworn heart has no joy. He cares little for this loss of delight, but his loss of imagination is actually the real loss that he has suffered. And he says that he was born with superpower of imagination, but it is almost dead now. And he tried to be patient, forgetting the loss that he had suffered. So he tried to cultivate the study of metaphysics so that once again he could be a natural man who does not sigh or shed tears all the time. Basically, this was his plan. And he keeps on saying that he practiced it, but it did not help him much. And tangled in metaphysics, he is still sad, unable to rouse imagination in him, unable to be creative, thoroughly incapacitated, and so melancholy. And then he goes on to tell us that the poet's mind is in the grip of sad thoughts born of the tragic reality of his life. He wants to get rid of them so that he can listen to the wind once again. In the raving wind, he hears a prolonged scream of agony. It is a mad scream, and the poet thinks that the wind uh, should go to places where its howling will not sound so discordant as it does here, to some bare crag, to some mountain train, to some blasted tree, some pine grove far, far away from any woodman's reach, or some witch haunted lonely house. and it is now causing havoc in this rainy month of April, creating the atmosphere of the Devil's Christmas. And the tragic atmosphere is full of painful sound of the wind. So the wind is like an actor or even a poet. And the sound made by the wind at the moment seems to be similar to the one made by a retreating army, its members groaning in pain and quivering in cold. And the sound is silent, and therefore there is a brief pause. Then another sound is heard, less fearful, a bit pleasant even. It is like a tender story written by Thomas Otway, of a little girl who lost her way on a desolate moor near her home. The little girl moaned low in grief and fear, and at times screamed loudly so that her mother might hear and come to rescue her. The wind is literally imitating these sounds. Now, finally, we see that the poet says that he is careworn and sleepless, but he wants that his friend may never suffer this predicament, this sleeplessness. And sleep, therefore, is becoming a wonderful anodyne that heals all the ailments. In the night, the storm may blow and the stars may twinkle, but they cannot touch the person in profound sleep. And the poet wishes her to rise in the morning, joyous and cheerful. He wants that the purity and freshness of her heart may spread all over nature. And there is something divine in her heart, and all things in nature should share that celestial element. And the poet finally wants her to rejoice forever and wishes that she may suffer no dejection in life whatsoever. So that is basically the substance of the poem, if I may put it like that. Okay. Now look, uh, when we look at dejection and ode, we see that since the publication of dejection and ode, আচ্ছা মোটামুটি পোয়েমে কি বলতে চাইছে সেটা ক্লিয়ার তো? হুম? মোটামুটি পোয়েমটাই কি বলতে চাইছে সেটা কি ক্লিয়ার? সেইটা আগে বল। কারণ স্টেপ বাই স্টেপ এগোনোটা বেটার। কিরে, যা চলেই গেল। পোয়েমে কি বলছে সেটা কি ক্লিয়ার? ওই হনুমান, যাই হোক বোধহয় তো নেট প্রবলেম করছে। হুম, বুঝতেই পেরেছি কানেকশন। যাই হোক, আজকে তো যা বৃষ্টি হচ্ছে কানেকশন প্রবলেম, আমিও ভাবছিলাম আমার কানেকশন প্রবলেম বোধহয় হবো। যাই হোক, এখনো হয়নি, লাকি মি। Now look, let's try to analyze the poem. Now, since the publication of Dejection and Ode in a collection called Sibylline Leaves almost 2 centuries ago, all forms of romantic criticism in general has ranged from taking the romantic lyric as a private soliloquy to treating it as public performance, because we have already talked about two kinds of odes, the personal soliloquy and public performance. Now, John Stuart Mill, who is one of the most famous 19th century philosophers, uh, suggests that the sincerity of lyric poetry corresponds with its private composition. Specifically, in his essay, uh, যা দেখছি রেকর্ডটা ভালো করে শুনতে হবে, দেন ওকে ফাইন, ঠিক আছে। Now, John Stuart Mill, specifically in his essay, Thoughts on Poetry and Its Varieties, which was published in 1833. In this essay, John Stuart Mill establishes that lyric poem as that the lyric poem as a sincere personal soliloquy was always overheard by the readers. Overheard টা করছে আছে। And he insisted that when the expression of the writer's emotions or of his thoughts tinged by his emotions is tinged also by that purpose, by the desire of making an impression upon another mind, then it ceases to be poetry and becomes eloquence. So কি জন স্টুয়ার্ট মিল বলছে একটা পার্সোনাল ওড যখন সে তার ইমোশনস গুলোকে পার্সোনাল ওড কি হচ্ছে সে পার্সোনাল ইমোশন দিয়ে কালার্ড এন্ড যখন পার্সোনাল ওডটা পড়ে ধর কোলরিজের পার্সোনাল ওড পড়ে তোর আর আমার মধ্যে সেম ইমোশনস গুলো জাগছে কারণ লাইফে এমন কেউ নেই বিশ্বাস কর পৃথিবীতে যে কখনো ডিজেকশন ফেস করেনি আমরা সবাই কম বেশি ডিজেক্টেড রেজিস্টেড হয়েছি সেই জায়গা থেকে জন স্টুয়ার্ট মিল বলছে যে যখন এই পোয়েমটা পড়ে পোয়েমটার ক্রাক্সটা মানে ডিজেকশনের সাবজেক্টটা যখন তোকে বা আমাকেও টাচ করবে তখন কি হবে না এই পোয়েমটার কালার দিয়ে আমরাও কালার্ড হব তখন ব্যাপারটা কি হচ্ছে না তখন আর সেটা পার্সোনাল ইমোশন থাকছে না তখন সেটা আর পার্সোনাল একটা কোনো ইন্সপিরেশন থাকছে না তখন সেটা কি হয়ে যাচ্ছে ইলোকুয়েন্স হয়ে যাচ্ছে পাবলিক ইলোকুয়েন্স হয়ে যাচ্ছে সো জন স্টুয়ার্ট মিল is trying to tie the two strands of personal and public odes. Now, for Mill, therefore, poetry was ideally about a poet's personal and emotional feelings, untouched concerns about outer relationships. বাট এই পার্সোনাল ফিলিংটা কি হচ্ছে না এই পার্সোনাল ফিলিংটা যখন বাইরে লোকের কানে যাচ্ছে তখন তাদের পার্সোনাল ফিলিংসে গিয়ে টাচ করছে and in that way it is becoming public in nature. However, the 21st century scholarship has begun to challenge the claim that sincerity is attained through private feelings in romantic lyrics. Like Susan Rosenbaum, in her book Professing Sincerity, states that uh, sincerity in the romantic and post-romantic poetry, post-romantic lyric, in many ways was a product of commercial culture. Poets who made a living from their writing sold the moral promise that their lyrics were sincere and engaged this conflict in their work. So দেখ এখানে ব্যাপারটা কি হচ্ছে না ও বলছে যে সিনসিয়ারিটি রোমান্টিক এজে কিরম ভাবে বিক্রি হতো না ইট ওয়াজ আ প্রোডাক্ট অফ কমার্শিয়াল কালচার ওকে সো সিনসিয়ারিটি ওয়াজ হোয়াট দ্য পিপল সোল্ড সো ওরা কি বলতো এটা আমার পার্সোনাল ইমোশন থেকে লেখা সো আমি ফিল করেছি দেয়ারফর ইটস সিনসিয়ার and in some ways sincerity became an ideal attribute of romantic poetry only when the authenticity of a poem was questioned due to its presence in the marketplace. Now, while it is tempting to make claims about the complete reversal of ideas in romantic scholarship over time, it is also very unfair to frame these arguments about romantic poetry in terms of old and new scholarship. কারণ প্রত্যেকটা এজ একটা এজকে ডিফারেন্ট ওয়েতে দেখে দ্যাটস দ্য ন্যাচারাল থিং Now, Mill struggles to discriminate between poetry and eloquence throughout his essay, and Rosenbaum writes about this conflict as a conflict between the marketplace and the good business of professing sincerity. Okay, now when we look at this poem, that is Dejection and Ode, from this perspective, let us argue that it was written with others in mind. কারণ সারা হাচিনসনকে নিয়ে লেখা তার তো ওয়ার্ডসওয়ার্থও আছে ডরোথিও আছে যেরকম কোলরিজ নিজের পার্সোনাল নোটবুকে মেনশন করছে So it was written with others in mind, yet the desire to make an impression did not commercialize his sincerity, since it naturally arose from his letter writing and lecturing. Because Coleridge was a public speaker, he was a public writer, and he was a public lecturer. So that was something which was very common for Coleridge. ওটা ওর কাছে জল ভাত আজকে তুই এটা কোনো নেতাকে নিয়ে যারা রেগুলার বেসিসে এদিক ওদিক লেকচার দিয়ে বেড়ায় তাদেরকে তুই নিয়ে গিয়ে কোথাও একটা দাঁড় করিয়ে দে একটা কোনো টপিক নিয়ে যেটা নিয়ে কিচ্ছু জানে না অন্তত সেটার উপর ঘন্টাখানেক বকে দেবে কারণ কি সেটা তাদের জন্য জল ভাত আজকে তুই আমাকে একটা টপিক ধর আমাকে আজকে তুই ম্যাকবেথ পড়াতে বললি আমার হাতের কাছে বইও নেই আমি কিন্তু ম্যাকবেথ নিয়ে ঘন্টাখানেক একটা লেকচার আরামসে দিয়ে দিতে পারবো আমি ম্যাকবেথ 1 বছর পড়িনি তাতেও আমি বলছি আমি ঘন্টাখানেক কিন্তু ম্যাকবেথ নিয়ে একটা লেকচার দিয়ে দিতে পারবো যে কেউ পারবে যারা ম্যাকবেথ পড়িয়েছে আজকে তুই আমার লুক ব্যাক ইন অ্যাঙ্গার নিয়ে লেকচার দিতে বল আমি দিয়ে দেবো আমার কোনো অসুবিধে নেই। আচ্ছা, তুই আমাকে ওয়েস্টল্যান্ড বা মাদার ইন দ্য ক্যাথিড্রাল নিয়ে লেকচার দিতে বল, আমি 1 ঘন্টার লেকচার না পড়ে না শুনে কিছু না করে দিয়ে দিতে পারবো। 1 ঘন্টা 1.5 ঘন্টা আমি বকে দিতে পারবো, কারণ কি এটা আমার হ্যাবিট হয়ে গেছে, এটা নিয়ে কথা বলে দিবো। এগুলো আজকাল আর নতুন করে বিশাল কিছু দেখতে হয় না আমাকে এখন। কিছু কিছু জিনিস কিছু কিছু মানে কোনটার পর কোনটা সাজিয়ে বলবো সেইটা দেখতে হয়, কারণ আমি অর্ডারটা ভুলে যাই। বাট আমি কি বলবো সেটা কিন্তু আমাকে আর দেখতে হয় না, কারণ এগুলো আমাদের কাছে এখন জল ভাত হয়ে গেছে। ঠিক সেরকমই কোল্ড্রিজের কাছে কিন্তু এগুলো পুরো জল ভাত হয়ে গেছিল। অ্যান্ড দেয়ার ফর বাদ বাকিদের কাছে যারা পাবলিক স্পিকার ছিল না, তাদের কাছে ব্যাপারটা যতটা কমার্শিয়ালাইজ করা, কোল্ড্রিজের ক্ষেত্রে কিন্তু এতটা কমার্শিয়ালাইজ নয়, ওটা ওর সিনসিয়ারিটির পার্টই হয়ে গেছে। এবার আমি যদি আজকে কাউকে কিচ্ছু না পড়ে কিচ্ছু না করে যদি আমি কাউকে আজকে মার্ডার ইন দ্য ক্যাথিড্রাল পড়াতে বসি, বা ধর পিগম্যালিয়ন পড়াতে বসি, বা ধর আমি ম্যাকবেথ পড়াতে বসি, বা ওয়েস্টল্যান্ড পড়াতে বসি, কেউ বুঝতে পারবে না। কেউ বুঝতে পারবে না, কেউ বলতে পারবে না যে আমি সিনসিয়ারলি তাকে পড়াইনি। বা আমি যদি কাউকে কুবলা খানি পড়াতে বসি, কেউ বলতে পারবে না যে তুমি সিনসিয়ারলি পড়াও। কেন পারবে না? কারণ দ্যাট হ্যাজ বিকাম আ পার্ট অফ মাই ট্রেড। ওগুলো আমি এতবারই পড়িয়েছি যে আমাকে আর নতুন করে কিছু দেখতে হয় না। আমি আজকাল কলেজে গেলে অর্ধেক দিনই আমার হাতে বইও থাকে না। আমাকে বাড়ির লোক এই নিয়ে বলে যে কি রে তুই কলেজ যাস, একটা বই নেই, খাতা নেই, কিচ্ছু নেই। আমরা কি করবো নিয়ে গিয়ে ফালতু? ওই যেভাবে বই নিয়ে যাবো সেভাবেই বই নিয়ে আসবো। কারণ লাগে না, সত্যি কথা বলতে গেলে এইগুলো পড়াতে গেলে লাগে না। হ্যাঁ, যেরকম কি ডিজেকশনের নোট আমি অনেক বছর বাদে পড়াচ্ছি, তো আমি একটু আমার কাছে এখানে আমি লিখে রেখে দিয়েছি সবকিছু পয়েন্ট বাই পয়েন্ট, আমি সেগুলো দেখে দেখে পড়াচ্ছি। বেশ কিছু কোটেশনস তো আমার কিছুই মনে থাকে না, তো আমি কোটেশন গুলো দেখে দেখে কোনটার পর কোনটা কি সাজাবো আমি সেটা সাজিয়ে নিয়েছি। একটু 15 মিনিট মতো সাজিয়ে নিয়েছি, আমি এবার সেটা থেকে দেখে দেখে বলছি। দ্যাট ইজ এ ডিফারেন্ট থিং। কিন্তু এটা যদি চেনা কবিতা হতো তখন তো আমার লাগতো না, উদিতা এটা তোর নয় বাবু, তুই পালা, তুই ওইটা দেখ, ব্রেকটা দেখ যা। সো হোয়াট হ্যাপেন্স ইজ দ্যাট therefore কোলরিজকে নিয়ে এখানটা ডাউট করার কোনো জায়গাটা নেই। Now, due to the influence of Coleridge's communication with others, most evident in the poem's modes of address, form, and language, is that let us argue that Dejection and Ode is a poem that is both heard and sincere, and it was made for publication. So, publication in the public what does. So, it was heard and sincere. Now, the personal modes of address in Dejection and Ode can be attributed primarily to the poem's textual history as a letter. And Dejection, in its earliest forms as a letter to a lady, was literally addressed multiple times for several intended addresses. Now, basically, what happened was that Coleridge's intimate relationship with the original addressees was the necessary catalyst for Coleridge and his portrayal of intense emotions. Now, the letter, আমরা যেরকম এখন মেলে করি না সিসি বিসিসি, কোলরিজ লেটারটাকে সিসি বিসিসি করেছিল। Originally, it was addressed to Sarah Hutchinson, but apart from that, it was also addressed to Thomas Poole, Robert Southey, Wordsworth, and others. So, therefore, what happens was that this poem was actually multi inspired, and the poem had as its initial readers a number of people, and Coleridge always took into consideration all of their suggestions. Now, dejection contains the personal insights that come as a result of writing to friends, which is not, which is unlike the uh, abstract, nameless ghost of a lady. কারণ সারা হাচিনসনকে কিন্তু কোলরিজ মেনশন করছে না। ওকে, নোটবুক যদি না পড়তাম আমরা জানতে পারতাম না যে এটা সারা হাচিনসনকে নিয়ে লেখা। অ্যান্ড সাবসিকুয়েন্টলি কোলরিজও এটা ডিনাই করেছে যে এটা সারা হাচিনসনকে নিয়ে লেখা। সো ওখানে শুধু লেডি ছিল। Now, at each junction where the lady in dejection is addressed, an insight or a strong emotion breaks through the unimpassioned grief. For example, at the end of verse 3, Coleridge seems resolved in his struggle to regain the passion and the life whose fountains are within. Yet, the address in the first line of verse 4 is, O lady, we receive but what we give. লাইন্স 46 47 পরপর দুটো লাইন দেখ। 46 এ বলছে যে দ্য প্যাশন অ্যান্ড দ্য লাইফ হুজ ফাউন্টেন্স আর উইদিন। লাইন 47 এ ঠিক পরের লাইনেই এসে কোলরিজ আবার বলছে, ও লেডি উই রিসিভ বাট হোয়াট উই গিভ। So what happens is that there is a stark transition from the heaviness of verse 3, and this acknowledgement of a relationship, even as a metaphor, is a turning point in the mood of the poem. Because the rest of verse 4 is hopeful with imagery of a wedding garment and the light of glory. Maybe line 49 there is a wedding garment, line 54 there is light a glory, which is issuing from the soul. Now, in a sense, after giving his poem to multiple addressees, Coleridge received the poetic inspiration that he was searching for. And therefore, in the ode, the lady fell easily into the placeholder for an addressee while retaining the intimate message. Now, Coleridge's direct address in his lecturing coincides with the similar attention getting devices in the poem itself. Just as he would periodically acknowledge the hypothetical concerns of his lecture uh, and his audience, and then continue on with his meandering lecture, Coleridge periodically addresses his muse, that is the lady, uh, to draw her attention to the main points of his poem. For example, let me cite one line. Line 47. O lady, we receive but what we give. This draws attention to Coleridge's important insight. There is the previous verse is burdened with a heavy language and contains no direct address. But Coleridge's mastery is in patterning his darker sentiments with aptly placed addresses to this lady as if she were in his live audience. So there is this conversational tone in Coleridge's Dejection and Ode. Similarly, Coleridge uses oratorical attention-getting devices such as from the soul must issue forth, line 53, and in line 9, look, for lo, the new winter moon bright, the new moon winter bright. Lo means behold. So as if he is addressing a live audience when he is dealing with this poem. Now, what happens is that this helps Coleridge to draw attention to phases of heightened emotion. And the oratorical devices engage the reader in the present moment of the scene and in the image of Coleridge's emotional sincerity. Now, the engagement created by the poem's oratorical address and interjections is enhanced by the 33 exclamation points throughout the whole poem. একটা poem 139 lines, তার মধ্যে there are 33 exclamation marks. And about one fourth of the poem is punctuated by exclamation points, therefore. And the rest is long comma filled phrases. So it's a meandering motion of Coleridge's emotion. Now, significantly, most of the exclamation points are located at the beginning and middle of the verse, and a little bit at the end of the poem, which mirrors the vocal signals of the rising and falling action in a lecture or a conversation. And the excitement at the beginning of a lecture captures the audience's attention when the speaker's volume rises at the height of his argument, and then the audience pays more attention to the main point, and so on and so forth. So that's how uh, it goes on. That is, the lecture itself goes on. So you see, this is a very interesting way of looking at the poem. So Coleridge was using oratorical skills in the poem to invest the poem with a conversational tone. Now, if we try to interpret the poem itself, we see that in Shelley, it is dialectics. That is, when if winter comes, can spring be far behind? It's more like a dialectic rhetorical question. In Coleridge, it is erratic, incomprehensible, and magical. That is, if the old moon is in the lap of the new moon, a storm is in the offing, and the thin crescent moon is bordering the whole of the moon, which is visible in the form of a faint shadow. And it is a rare sight, and Coleridge, like the writer of the ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, believes that it forebodes a sudden stir in nature in the form of a strong gale. Now, he himself is passing through a dull, monotonous phase, and uh, there is pain in his heart, which is gradually corroding him. But there is no violence in this pain. Nothing spectacular about it. Dull, boring pain like weevil is eating into the vitals of his personality, and he wants a kind of a big shake, a storm, to rouse him to his creativity. Just like Rabindranath says, "ওরে ঝড় নেমে আয়, আয় রে আমার শুকনো পাতার ডালে, যা প্রাণহীন, যা পুরাতন, যা আনন্দ হারা, আহ, চরম রাতের অশ্রুধারায় আজ হয়ে যাক সারা," and so on and so forth. Now, Shelley prays to the west wind to make him its lyre, to lift him from the thorns of life where he has fallen. But Coleridge does not have that strength for prayer. He also needs that kind of a lift, but he knows that it can only come to him, if at all, through a miracle. And there can be no reason behind it, nor can any prayer do anything to help him. But strange things happen in nature, and even if we call it supernatural, then also Coleridge has the belief that such a strangeness, such an uncanny thing can come to him in his life. Now he understands that the nature of pain is that it corrodes you from within, it is self defeating, it is unproductive, and he needs joy which is counteractive to pain, which can elate him, which is purposeful and which is creative. And Wordsworth shares this similar crisis in Dejection and in the Ode on Intimations of Immortality. The similar concerns are reciprocated by Wordsworth there. Now, Dejection and Ode was written in 1802, and Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality was written in 1806. Now, prior to the writing of these poems, the two poets had identical feelings, and they had really long discussions and apprehensions of a failure of their only talent. Now, with Coleridge, it was a deeper crisis. Now, C.M. Baura, in his The Romantic Imagination, points out that, I'm quoting Baura, he knew that something catastrophic had happened to him, and he was afraid that his creative gifts were ruined. He put the blame on his lack of happiness, but he knew that whatever the cause might be, the results were grave indeed. So, this is what Baura says. So, Coleridge was the more emotional of the two. Now, Wordsworth tried to overcome the feeling with the help of a broad philosophy, a larger view of life, reinstating his faith in nature as the guardian, the caretaker, the nurturer, the matron of the human soul. And much of his ode is a reply to Coleridge's problem, and indirectly, Wordsworth helps himself too. But Coleridge addresses to Sarah Hutchinson and says that she is full of joy, and so to her everything is blissful, whereas Coleridge himself is full of sadness, and therefore to him everything is dreary. Now, when Coleridge was cutting this poem short in almost less than half, then Sarah Hutchinson became the lady, and later, as I have said, that he denied the idea that it was ever dedicated to Sarah Hutchinson. Now, many people, many subsequent critics have expressed this opinion that actually the poem was never really dedicated to Sarah, but it was from its original moment dedicated to Wordsworth, and Sarah just merely was the occasion. Uh, Now, whatever it might have been, in its final form, it is addressed to a lady, and it makes the poem impersonal rather than interpersonal. Now, Wordsworth turns to Coleridge's 6-year-old child Hartley and finds exuberance in him. and the child's unbridled joy makes him philosophize about life and its growth through years. And he feels that through philosophical understanding, one can rationalize loss and regain confidence. And Wordsworth never seems to be entirely broken down, but Coleridge was actually a wreck right at this moment. And it is more so because of Coleridge's idea that nature cannot be benign enough to extend a hand of comfort in our hours of need, because she does not have any distinct entity. She is not a positive force, neither is she a negative force. Nature, more or less, is nonchalant, and it is only the human perception that gives nature its meaning and its value. So, while for Wordsworth nature was a perceiving, living, breathing entity, for Coleridge nature was that nonchalant idea which was all around us, and we gave it a shape and a color. So, what happens over here is that Coleridge is more like Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Wordsworth is more like a pantheistic Tagore. Now, what happens is that if we are happy, according to Coleridge, we see happiness everywhere in nature. That makes us all the more happy. But if we are sad, we see sadness everywhere in nature, and that makes us gloomier. And in this way, uh, Coleridge comes very close to that phase of Rabindranath, where Rabindranath, uh, with his subjective philosophy, says that আমার চেতনার রঙে পান্না হলো সবুজ. Now I translated this as, "'tis the color of my conscience that makes the emerald green and the ruby red. I look up to the sky and light flashes in the east and the west. I see the rose and call beautiful, and it turns beautiful." But the I of Tagore is the Godhead, and Coleridge's we is nothing more than the human mind and its reflexes. So it's like the, what should I call it? It's like the human correspondence. He knows that the lady is full of joy, which is given only to the pure heart. Now, when we are very close to nature, this joy is born in our heart, and as it matures, it gives birth to other joys, and everything turns colorful and melodious. Now, there was a time when Coleridge's life was also filled with such a delight, and this helped him to overcome all forms of strain and suffering. And his imagination was very, very active. But thereafter, each moment of dejection has weakened his imagination and enervated his soul. And therefore, he turns to philosophy, and he tried to get some solace in the broad generalizations about the human fate. And metaphysics never helped him in this way. Now, the change of mood, the change of tone, etc., these are very common things in the poem. But if we look at the poem structurally, then we see that the poem was divided into 8 uneven parts with 139 lines together. It has a single theme, which is dejection. There is the need for love to overcome it, and a prayer to nature for a stormy shake-up, and it's elaborated in great length. Now, this poem has a problem. That is, unlike the rhyme of the ancient mariner, which is also divided in parts, where the parts go on sequentially, there is each part develops on the earlier part. Here we have two distinct ideas. First, that the poet is sad. Second idea is that the lady is happy. And there is a third prayer, that may she never have to suffer the same sorrow that the poet has suffered. As simple as that. But the problem is that the three parts are not very congruent to each other. Suddenly, he keeps on going on and on and on about his own sadness, his own sorrow, his own dejected feelings. Then suddenly he talks about the lady who is full of joy. And then finally comes the prayer, which is uh, about the lady not being hurt, as the poet is, via the dejection, the feeling of dejection. Now, if we treat this poem as an autobiographical poem, then we see that both Wordsworth and Coleridge felt almost simultaneously that their poetic powers were on the decline. And this unnerved them because of their total identity was being as poets. And the loss of that identity would mean a kind of spiritual death for them. Now, decline in that one talent made them apprehensive of death, and it caused fear. It caused a sort of paranoia. And Wordsworth tried to overcome fear by turning to the religio-philosophical explanation of the soul's journey to a larger extent, to a larger world, and which kind of resuscitated. But as C.M. Baura has pointed out already, that the problem was greater for Coleridge, and therefore dejection was a greater problem for Coleridge. And Coleridge felt that nature in itself would not provide him any psychological sustenance, and he would need to reinstate his psychological sustenance, perhaps by looking at the night, looking at the lady. Now, dejection, uh, an ode, gives us an inkling of Coleridge's mind, and if you just look at the images, then you will see that the images are of darkness of night, of howling storm, of crescent moon, of viper thought, dark dream, devil's yule, lonesome wild, etc. So it suggests a kind of despair in its worst form. But there is one redeeming factor, that is his realization that joy is the most important thing in life, and it comes like a fountain from within. And he is very happy to see the lady who is happy. So the lady is associated with joy. So from nature, he turns to a human person for inspiration of his joy. Now, if we try to understand that how is this poem a romantic poem? Because the theme is dejection. It is the failure of romantic imagination and the subsequent grief on the account of that. But still, it is one of the finest examples of romantic poetry. How? Because in emotional depth, in passionate feeling, in intensity of experience, and in expression, selection of images, lyrical flow, in the structural arrangement, it is a representative poem of the romantic revival. It was a return to nature, but with a consciousness of the self. Now, what happens is that poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge, they made their life, the events of their life, the subject matter of their poetry. And therefore, the autobiographical element, which we can trace in poems like say, the Daffodils, Kubla Khan, um, Tintin Abbey, the Prelude, wrote on intimations of immortality, are very well there in Coleridge's Dejection as well. But whereas the tone of moralizing is very important to Wordsworth, for Coleridge, the role of romantic didacticism is very conspicuously missing. So Coleridge তোকে জ্ঞান দিতে চায় না. Coleridge rather wants you to, Coleridge তোর সঙ্গে বসে কথা বলতে চায়. আমি বারবার করে লেকচারে বলছেন যে this poem is very autobiographical and it is a very conversational poem. অ্যান্ড প্রত্যাশা তুই জয়েন করার আগেই আমরা এটা নিয়ে, অভিরূপ তখন ছিল, নেটের প্রবলেম চলে গেল, আমরা এটা নিয়েই ডিসকাস করছিলাম যে কিরম করে দিস পোয়েম ইজ লাইক আ লেকচার, যেখানে একজন লেকচার দিতে দিতে অডিয়েন্স কি ভাবছে, অডিয়েন্স কি বুঝছে, সেই অ্যাকর্ডিংলি নিজের আইডিয়াস গুলোকে শিফট করা অ্যান্ড আইডিয়াস গুলোকে রিঅ্যাডজাস্ট করে, মাঝে মাঝে অডিয়েন্সের কনসার্ন গুলোকে বোঝে, বুঝে বলে যে এই দেখো তোমার মনে হয়তো এই কোয়েশ্চেনটা আছে, বাট এই কোয়েশ্চেনটার আনসারটা কিন্তু এইটা, বলে এগোয়। এই যে কনভারসেশনাল টোনটা যেটা, দ্যাট ইজ বিং মেনটেন্ড। সো পুরো লেকচারটা শুনলেই তোরা এটা দেখতে পাবি। এক সেকেন্ড, হ্যাঁ। Now, as Wordsworth has suggested, romantic poetry is like a man speaking to men. So that formula is here as well. Now, the poem opens with a strange reference, the extract from a ballad, and it is quoted at the very outset that if the old moon is in the lap of the new moon, a storm is in the offing. Now, the whole of the moon is faintly visible because a bit of sunlight reached it, being reflected from the earth. And on its edge, the crescent new moon looks like a pride girdle holding the old moon as if on its lap. And the connection between this sight and the possible storm is entirely magical or superstitious. যেরকম তোদের মনে আছে কিনা আমার জানি না, রাইডার্স টু দ্য সিতে মুনের পাশে যদি আর কি একটা স্টার দেখা যায় তাহলে ঝড় বৃষ্টি হবে। But the romantic imagination creates that suspension of disbelief over here where we take it on the face value. And then we see that there is actually an inner storm which is going on, which is raging on. And the poet wants an objective correlative for that inner storm. যে আমার ভেতরে storm চলছে, আমি একটা বাইরের storm চাই, which will compensate, which will reciprocate the inner storm. Okay, so দেখ এখানে বলছে might now perhaps their wanted impulse give and might startle this dull pain and make it move and leave. So যদি বাইরে একটা storm আসে তাহলে কি হবে? It might perhaps their wanted impulse give. So আমার ভেতরে যে desired impulse-টা সেটা হয়তো জেগে উঠবে and might startle this dull pain and make it move and leave. And therefore this relationship between the external and the internal, that is the outer nature and inner nature, is basically a connection between the man and nature. So therefore the romantic preoccupation of the relationship between man and nature is being established over here. Also the subjective approach that the external world is nothing more than what we think of it, is that human imagination is the most important thing, is essentially romantic. And the Coleridge বলছে, "Oh lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is her wedding garment, ours her shroud." So it is this subjectivity of man's thought which is thrusted on nature, which is very interesting. And this also emphasizes on man's psychological condition, and that is man's projection of his mindset on nature itself. So what happens is that we see that, like Shelley, like Wordsworth, what Coleridge constructs here is a series of images, a series of paraphernalia for his poetry to represent man's relationship with nature. It is man's own intimate moment of grief, of feeling dejected, of feeling unwanted, and man's prospect of love, which might redeem man. These issues come together and these form a grand narrative which is Dejection and Ode itself. ঠিক আছে, যতটা বোঝানোর ছিল বুঝিয়ে দিচ্ছি, এর বেশি আর ডিজেকশন এন্ড ওডে কিছু নেই। এর বেশি তোরা কিছু খুঁজে পেলে আমাকে জানাস, ঠিক আছে? আজকে থেমে যাচ্ছি, ভিডিওটা ভালো করে পুরোটা একবার দেখ, দেখে কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন থাকলে আমাকে জানা। ডিজেকশনের উপর যা ম্যাটেরিয়াল আছে দিয়ে দেবো, একটা ম্যাটেরিয়াল আছে দিয়ে দেবো, that would be more than enough for you to understand ডিজেকশন এন্ড ওড, ঠিক আছে? ওটা থেকেই তোর সব আনসার বেরিয়ে যাবে। ওকে,
স্যার বলছি একটা কথা ছিল, বলছি ওই ইন মেমোরিয়ামের আমাদের কিছু একটা দিলে ভালো হতো। আমাদের ওই যে ফার্স্ট পয়েন্টটাই আছে, ওই স্ট্রং আছে আমাদের।
ফার্স্ট আর লাস্টটা তাই তো
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ,
দিয়ে দেবো,
ওটা আসলে
কিন্তু
আমাদের
মঙ্গলবারের আগে দিতে পারবো না।
ঠিক আছে, তাই দিয়ে আবার ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে ওটা
আমাকে একটু সোমবার রাত্রিবেলা একটা হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ করে দিবি, ঠিক আছে?
ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে
ওকে,
ঠিক
চলো
আছে।
থেমে,
হুম
গুড
হুম
নাইট।